Hello, everyone. Because the virtual world is vast and wide, I'm going to begin by saying to everyone, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be joining us from. My name is Tina Campt, and I wear a number of different hats on and off or in front of or behind this Zoom screen. I am professor of humanities and modern culture and media studies here at Brown University. I also lead the Black Visualities Initiative at the Koget Humanities Institute. In addition to that, I am a research associate at the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. That's called VIAD, and it'll come back in my introduction. And finally, I am one of the conveners of the Practicing Refusal Collective. On behalf of my fellow members of the collective, I am delighted to welcome you to the second virtual installation of the Sojourner project. As I explained when I introduced the first activation of this series back in November, the Practicing Refusal Collective, a forum that has dedicated itself to fostering new dialogues on Blackness, anti-Black violence, and Black futurity in the 21st century, the Practicing Refusal Collective began the Sojourner Project back in 2019 as part of a broader effort to decenter the United States in our discussions by learning from the insights and perspectives of African and African diasporic communities outside of the United States. This year, we are partnering with VIAD in Joburg and Art for Humanity in Durban to engage South African perspectives on questions of anti-Blackness and Black futurity. Each of the sessions in this series is the brainchild of one or more members of our collective who've agreed to curate dialogues, discussions, listening sessions, workshops, or other formats configured around a keyword that we believe warrants urgent attention in the current global reckoning with Black precarity, possibility, and futurity. In addition to today's session, we're going to be hosting one additional public activation curated by Christina Sharp and Dion Brand on the keywords cartography and catastrophe. That session is going to be on April 30th, and they're going to be enjoined in conversation with Torkwasi Dyson, Canizia Lubrin, Kevin Brown, and Dele Adeyemo. You will find additional information on that particular session, as well as on this session, our previous session in November, and on two upcoming workshops by collective members Tavia Nyong'o and Mabel Wilson on our website. And the website is The Sojourner Project, all one word, lowercase.org. As ever, such events are always a collective effort. And before beginning the session, I need to acknowledge the work of some of the people who made this transatlantic collaboration possible. On the South African end, we thank James McDonald, Ismail Farouk, Russell Hulangwane, as well as the transatlantic brilliance of Nonsi Motiti, who is always both here and in Southern Africa as well. On the US end, we thank Tavia Nyong'o, Amanda Anderson, Damian Mahid, Trauda Kasna, Louis Oppenheimer, and Kyle Sloan. We thank all of you for assembling so many disparate pieces into what feels like a really seamless and cohesive whole. And now, without further delay, I would like to transition to the main event and conversation by introducing the curator of today's session, Deborah Thomas. Deborah holds appointments as the R. Jean Brownlee Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography at the University of Pennsylvania. And like me, she is also a research associate with our partner, VIAD, at the University of Johannesburg. She is the author of 2 books and producer and director of 2 films, curator of an acclaimed multimedia exhibition, and editor of several important edited collections. And as if this were not enough, she is an extraordinary mentor. She is a fierce advocate and activist. She likes to call herself a former professional dancer, even though we know that there is no such thing. And I'm very proud to call her one of my dearest friends. So without delay, over to you, Deb.
Thank you, Tina, for that very sweet introduction. And thank you, everybody who has gathered and everybody who has enabled this gathering. So I'm going to introduce this sort of broad overview of our concerns today, and then I'm going to introduce the participants, and they will each speak for about 10, 12 minutes. Then I will throw out some questions to the panelists, get them talking, and then we will open up to Q&A from you. So if you develop a question while somebody is speaking at any point, you can use the Q&A, and those questions will be addressed at the end. Okay, so what we want to think through today is the utility of the concept of sovereignty. And we want to think through sovereignty outside of normative frames. And by this, I mean that if one were to read a classic political text on sovereignty, one would expect to see references to Hobbes, to the Treaty of Westphalia, maybe even to anti-colonial struggles for independence. And here, sovereignty is understood as the political achievement of the liberal democratic nation state, the results of struggles to create new, more egalitarian societies in which rights-bearing citizens contribute to the life of the state through taxes, through their political participation, in order to receive benefits in return, such as education, healthcare, insurance. In these kinds of texts, the story of sovereignty is told through the lens of the executive, right? That is, it's concerned with who seizes state power within a liberal Western iteration of nation-state politics. And this is one reason that sovereignty has become something of a disavowed category within Black studies. However, sovereignty remains both conceptually and materially pertinent for Black people across many locations, for those in the so-called post-colonial world, of course, and also for those in majority Black spaces. And many of us are in fact obsessed with sovereignty and with what sovereignty feels like or could feel like. But this obsession isn't one that's framed by the state or within the parameters of its institutions. So for us, the point of bearing witness to state violence and other forms of violence, the point of creating different archives and affective relationships to violence is to chart new terrain upon which a different idea of sovereignty could be elaborated and radiated. So we're always imagining something that looks like sovereignty, and if it feels out of reach, we're compelled to reach toward it anyway. So our baselines today are that sovereignty cannot be disavowed as either false consciousness or ontological impossibility, as these frames, we feel, rely too heavily upon masculinist notions of revolution and humanness. And instead, we want to privilege the ephemeral, the performative, the affective, the non-linear, unexpected ways that something that feels like sovereignty circulates and is transmitted from one to another. So let me introduce our participants today. I'll start with Khwezi Mkhize, who is lecturer in the Department of African Literature at the University of the Witwatersrand. He graduated with a PhD from the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania in 2015. Prior to moving to Wits, he taught in the English department at the University of Cape Town, and his research interests include African literatures, South African literatures, empire and studies of colonialism, post-colonial theory, Pan-Africanism, and the Black diaspora. Khwezi is co-editor of the journal African Studies and is currently working on his first book manuscript, tentatively titled A Homemade Empire, South Africa and the Imperium Before World War II. Savannah Shange is assistant professor of anthropology at University of California, Santa Cruz, and also serves as principal faculty in critical race and ethnic studies. Her research interests include gentrification, multiracial coalition, ethnographic ethics, Black femme gender, and abolition. She earned her PhD in Africana Studies and Education from the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in teaching from Tufts University, and a BFA from the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. Her first award-winning book, Progressive Dystopia, Abolition, Anti-Blackness, and Schooling in San Francisco, is an ethnography of the afterlife of slavery as lived in the Bay Area. Her current research project examines the racial politics of breastfeeding in the Gulf South. And finally, we have Gabrielle Goliath, who situates her practice within contexts marked by the traces, disparities, and as of yet unreconciled traumas of colonialism and apartheid, as well as socially entrenched structures of patriarchal power and rape culture. Enabling opportunities for affective relational encounters, she seeks to resist the violence through which Black, brown, feminine, queer, and vulnerable bodies are routinely fixed through forms of representation. Goliath has exhibited widely and was recently commissioned to present a new body of work at the Kochi, Missouri's Biennale 2021. Her solo exhibition, This Song Is For, is currently installed at the Zico South African National Gallery and will travel in 2021 to Constance, Stockholm, and the Durban Art Gallery, South Africa. Goliath has won a number of awards, including a Future Generation Art Prize, Special Prize, the prestigious Standard Bank Young Artist Award, as well as the Institut Français Afrique en Création Prize at the Bamako Biennale. Her work features in numerous public and private collections, including the Tate Modern, Zico South African National Gallery, Johannesburg Art Gallery, and the Wits Arts Museum. She teaches at the Wits School of Art in Johannesburg and is currently a PhD candidate with the Institute for Creative Arts at the University of Cape Town. So I am going to hand things over to Khwezi now, who will begin with his own remarks.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Deb. I'd like to just begin by thanking Tina for extending the invitation, Deb for bringing this panel together, staff at VET, Kundia, Kundai, James, Chowder, Brown, Lewis, Kyle, and of course, Nonsikelelo. So it's more going to be afterlives of empire than practices of freedom, I realized as I was sort of scribbling down some notes. So yeah, this comes from my own sort of brief sort of 3 years in Cape Town, and I'm constantly thinking about what that experience meant for me. So I'm constantly going back to it. So I'm going to show a number of about 3 or so images and then a video, and then I'll do a bit of reading and then try to tie things together. So that's an image of Cecil John Rhodes in the Rhodes Memorial. And for many people remember that in 2015, after the Rhodes Fall protests, the statue of Rhodes was removed from the University of Cape Town, but this statue was not. So someone decided to cut off the nose. The nose has been replaced. Late in December 2018, a group of activists gathered on the exclusive 4th Beach in Clifton, Cape Town, to conduct a ceremony to exorcise the demon of racism. With the sheep in tow, the group caused a stir as crowds gathered, some in dismay at the ceremony, citing the sheep's right to life. This moment marked the spilling of the energies of Rose Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall movement into the geographies of the Cape outside of the university. Indeed, the staging of the ceremonial protest on the littoral signaled an imaginary repulsion of the colonial settlement that came on ships in the 17th century. About a month later, the Cape Party staged a counter-protest. Flanking the party's leader, Jack Miller, a small group carried its sacrificial token, a watermelon, believe it or not, to the same beach to counter the, quote, aggressive cultural imperialism which seeks to eradicate our way of life.
We like to share watermelon with friends.
liberal racism aside, the Cape Party's demonstration marks something substantial about the staging of sovereignty in post-apartheid South Africa. Jack Miller and the Cape Party occupy a negligible place in the broader landscape of South African politics. It listed its official membership at the time the video was shot at around 10,000. Its politics are clearly anti-colonial, carving out the Cape as an exceptional geography imprisoned by South Africa's path toward a failed African state. Its desires for sovereignty explicitly echo Britain's imperial nostalgia, charting an indelible kinship between Wexit and Brexit. And yes, Wexit is a thing. As an advocate for Cape independence noted, quote, Brexit was the result of ordinary British citizens bringing the politicians that led them to heel. Cape independence is its South African cousin, end quote. In this turn toward the defense of the legacy of British imperial liberalism, what are we to make of Jack Miller's demeaning peace offering of a watermelon? On the one hand, Miller is invoking the archive of liberalism in South Africa as singularly commensurable with the Cape. He kind of has a point. Indeed, the institutions of colonial governmentality were established in the Cape during the 19th century as the British government conferred responsible and representative government to the colony. But as the 19th century drew to a close and Cecil John Rhodes ascended Cape politics, the cacophony of liberalism easily oscillated between granting equal rights to all white men south of the Zambezi to granting equal rights to all civilized men south of the Zambezi. There is a thread between this moment and Miller's pithy beach protest. The watermelon gesture, one which relies on an abject black or colored presence to make any meaning in spite of his claim to the ridiculousness of race, calls our attention to, as Saidiya Hartman reminds us in Scenes of Subjection, and I quote, the forms of violence and domination enabled by the recognition of humanity, licensed by the invocation of rights, and justified on the grounds of liberty and freedom, end quote. In other words, in spite of calls to decolonize the Cape as the original geography of coloniality in South Africa, there remains the stubborn violence of white conviviality and its tropes of recognition. In Yvette Christiansen's novel, Unconfessed, to which I'll return later, the narrative voice and protagonist Sila says this about the Cape and its genealogies of racial abandonment. We are the offsprings of the Cape of Good Hope, and the Cape of Good Hope is the place that fathers one branch of what the minister's wife calls a family tree, while another is mothered. And let me tell you, that place makes us who we are, but it will deny us, end quote. This is the recursive history that binds Jack Miller and Cecil John Rhodes together, to whiteness as the unmarked category of liberal citizenship and its embodied repertoires of sovereignty. Okay, this is a different section. And this section corresponds to the image here. On the 9th of March, 2016, and in celebration of its first anniversary, Rhodes Must Fall mounted an exhibition of its year-long history when it captured the political imagination as the so-called born-free generation of post-apartheid South Africa. The exhibition was a failure. In fact, it never happened. In a gesture that ironically turned Rhodes Must Fall inside out, the Trans Collective, and some of the members are there, a collective of transgender student activists formerly affiliated with Rhodes Must Fall, stormed the Center for African Studies Gallery, painted its walls, and the various images representing significant moments in the history of Rhodes Must Fall red to mark the masculinist exclusions that were being monumentalized. As in 2015, there was an occupation, this time against the entrance of Rhodes Must Fall into the annals of history. If the anniversary exhibition was to confer upon us a sense of the success and possible ongoingness of Rhodes Must Fall, the Trans Collective did more than disrupt this narrative. Arguably, this occupation and protest brought Rhodes Must Fall officially to an end, calling into question the various hegemonies that had filtered into the official narrative of the movement. But there's something significant about this movement as refusal and failure. In The Queer Art of Failure, Jack Halberstam reminds us of the queer significance of failure. And I quote, under certain circumstances, failing, losing, forgetting, unmaking, undoing, unbecoming, not knowing, may in fact offer more creative, more cooperative, more surprising ways of being in the world. failing is something queers do and have always done exceptionally well. For queers, failure can be a style, and it can, or a way of life, and it can stand in contrast to the grim scenarios of success that depend upon trying and trying again. In fact, if success requires so much effort, then maybe failure is easier in the long run and offers different rewards, end quote. In other words, failure allows us to escape the punishing norms and discipline, that disciplined behavior and manage human development in the goal of delivering us from unruly childhoods to orderly and predictable adulthoods. That was a quote. The point is not to simply celebrate the failure of the commemoration of Rose Fall, but perhaps ask deeper questions about what the meaning of its success would have been. What would it have meant for a movement that had gone against the university to find itself a mere year later inscribed into its halo walls as a sign of progress? Who indeed is the master narrator of the success story? Does success not at times conscript usurpers into the very same structures that they dismantle? Who succeeds then? Who survives or triumphs to tell this story? Who is not allowed to be inscribed in the official narrative of success or the movement? Do these movements from margins to the center mirror in some ways familiar narratives where decolonization leads to the manning of the post-colony and thereby a distortion of the anti-colonial struggle? And it's these thresholds that invite us to think not simply about the limits of sovereignty, of the sovereignty of the nation state, but of the other multiple genealogies of the sovereign that complicate its trajectory. When Kevin Carter took this image of Inkatha Freedom Party members brandishing what the apartheid government called, and I kid you not, traditional cultural weapons, South Africa was in the grip of violence leading to the first democratic elections in 1994. As Rob Nixon put it, and I quote, "This attempt to fob off Inkatha's bloodstained arsenal as the ornaments of pure Zuluness was merely the latest update of a century-old effort by South Africa's rulers to invent and reinvent Zulu traditions to white hegemonic advantage," end quote. Now, Zulu martial nationalism had real claims on the late apartheid state, buttressed by, as Paul Lahauser puts it, the dreams of restitution and immortality which lie at the heart of nationalism, end quote. Many will recall that in 2015, the Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini, said in a gathering that, quote, "foreigners must pack their bags and go home," end quote, and a new spate of xenophobic violence erupted. He later claimed that he had been misquoted, but the genie was out of the bottle. That, in some parts, Afrophobia is managed through the scripts of Zulu martial nationalism recalls the afterlives of forms of ethnic sovereignty that have not been completely contained by the post-apartheid state. I have given just a few of many versions of sovereignty in post-apartheid South Africa, but the provocations that I've been making are hinged on these forms as in excess of, or contra, or in spite of the post-apartheid state. And this is right outside Parliament where, in October, after sort of protests at the beginning of Fees Must Fall, students sort of broke through the barrier and of course, tear gas and stun grenades. And this protest sort of juxtaposes the call for justice for Collins Khoza and Black Lives Matter. And I'll speak to this in a moment, right? Spiritual afterlives. Yvette Christiance's Unconfessed takes as its point of departure her archival encounter in Cape Town's Ruland Street Jail cum archive with a poignant court case of pedicide by a slave woman whose only utterance during her confession is that being hartseer or heartsore, heartbroken in Afrikaans or Dutch, led to her killing her child Barrow, an act of defiance against the peculiar institution into which she had birthed him. Unconfessed turns the silences of the archive into a compelling story against post-apartheid or apartheid, South Africa's multiple silences, particularly about slavery and forms of racial and gender subjection that were no less foundational. If Sila's dead son Barrow's presence is a ghostly specter in the novel, and one that Sila herself chooses not to turn away from, then the kind of captive maternal labor that she dutifully performs, tending to the spirit of the dead, stands as a poignant reminder of the ethics of care and memory that lie both beyond official archives and narratives, and that pose a specter against the present and its vexed claims of historical transcendence. But if tending to the dead, the ancestors, or the disappeared calls the living simultaneously into a kind of post-emancipation and post-apartheid wake, then the future-oriented grand narratives of betterment that are evidently in crisis demand that we ask different questions about how to tend to absences and the unspeakable. Here, it might be useful to turn to Tina Camp's suggestion that, quote, the infraordinary as a space of the everyday practices we don't always notice and whose seeming insignificance requires excessive attention, stretches the limits of contemporary discourses of resistance, opening up a sense of the practice of refusal as an extension of the range of creative responses of Black communities have marshaled in the face of racialized dispossession, end quote. And also, I might add, against the violence of the post-colonial and post-apartheid state. Here, the murder of Collins Khosa, Nathaniel Julies, and others by police forces during the lockdown last year happened alongside government officials endorsing Black Lives Matter protests in South Africa and globally. I would, following Bhekizizwe Peterson, read this moment in conjunction with the post-apartheid government's ongoing projection of the country's social and economic contradictions on the personal behavior and responsibilities. In the meanwhile, people on the ground continue to negotiate their personal anguishes, responsibilities, and state abandonment in ways that exceed even the language of redress contained in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Peterson captures this well in his description of Metao's search for her disappeared daughter Dineo in his and Ramadan Suleiman's film of 2004, Zulu Love Letter. And if you haven't seen Zulu Love Letter, yeah, it's well worth your time. Metao, for her part, and I quote, is illustrative of how ordinary people faced with different forms of alienation respond to African beliefs on the intrinsic relations between self and community, the living and the dead, and the sanctity of the body, whether it is alive or passed on. The concern was the need to resolve the problems around the thousands who disappeared and who, should they have been killed, placed a number of spiritual and cultural liabilities on their relatives. The absent body, in the case of the disappeared, acted as a dialogic catalyst in first calling into question what is considered to be sensible and normative in the new dispensation, and second, by setting the scene for engagements with the violence and traumas of the past and post-apartheid South Africa, end quote. I'm almost done. It is precisely that these ethical, spiritual, and metaphysical relations, quote, exceed juridical and political understandings of justice, end quote, that complicates the terrain in which the state seeks to intervene on behalf of its citizens and mediate their senses of experiences of time, past, present, and the future. One cannot ignore the ongoing spiritual turn of the return of the ancestors, especially among younger Black South Africans. What do we make of this? It is not a question that I can fully deal with, but attending to its frequencies indeed requires a degree of quiet. Bodies that are not quite sovereign in the sense of embodying Western modes of self-fashioning, future-oriented subjectivity, but that are attended to by the many and unnameable silences of history under the insignia of the ancestors, open up another dimension of experience on multiple planes, subjective and temporal all at once. Here, I can't help but think about the ending of Unconfessed. Sala's release from Robben Island roughly coincides with the end of slavery in the Cape and the British Empire in 1834. But Sala is not so much drawn to this new moment and the promises of the emancipation. She tends to the absent, stories that need to be, even if they are to take possession of us as ghosts. It is in the break that is the small body of water that is the Atlantic Ocean separating Robben Island and Cape Town that we see, indeed, that the sea is history. Thank you.
I will go ahead. And for those of you who know me, you know that my obsessions over the years have had to do with the Caribbean. and with processes of coloniality in the Western Hemisphere. And I've been grappling in different ways with the following questions. If the modern West was built on indigenous dispossession and slavery through the development of plantation-based agriculture, and if both indigenous and African descended populations were excluded from modern personhood, then what could it possibly mean to be human politically in the wake of the West? So this is the big question that has haunted me over the past many years as I've been developing archives of the relationships between sovereignty and violence in Jamaica. And for me, the development of different forms of archives, right? They could be narrative, performative, sonic, visual, and my practice of assembling them alongside each other and alongside already existing and usually quite difficult archives has been geared toward generating tough conversations about personhood, politics, violence, liberation. I've been generally interested in opening new spaces in which people might connect with each other across both time and space. And by space here, I mean to signify the geographic, generational, socioeconomic, political, and I think most importantly, imaginative and speculative spheres of thought and action. And my hope is that in so connecting, people might think through their own relations to these archives, and that we might be able to elaborate new foundations for sociality. So what I'm going to talk about today has to do with archiving anti-Black state violence. And indeed, I'm going to talk about the extent to which anti-Black state violence is actually a legible phrase within a majority Black setting. So the answer to the question of whether Black lives might matter in majority Black spaces would seem to many to be a foregone conclusion. They would imagine that lacking a history of de facto apartheid or segregation, a Black country like Jamaica could not be structured by the same racial dynamics that plague the United States. And that this is far from the case occasionally becomes clear when we screen our film 4 Days in May in Jamaica. And what you're watching now is actually a different version. It's a short, non-narrative version of that film without the soundtrack. The film features narratives we recorded with residents of West Kingston after the Tivoli incursion in 2010. And by we, I mean myself, Deanne Bell, who is a community psychologist, and musician Junior Gabu Wedderburn. During the incursion, Jamaican security forces, supported by the United States, entered the Tivoli Gardens community in search of Christopher Dudus Coke, who had been ordered for extradition to the United States to stand trial for drug and gun running charges. The search for Coke resulted in the deaths of at least 74 civilians. And in the film, mothers describe watching their sons being executed. A brother mourns the killing of a sibling, shot execution style next to his stepfather. An aunt talks about having to identify her nephew's body, part of which had been burned beyond recognition. Other young men describe being taunted by soldiers, made to run while shots were being fired after them, being tied to other men and kept in a leaky bathroom overnight, not knowing whether they were going to live or die. Tivoli Gardens has always been what one resident called the flagship community for the Jamaica Labour Party, the mother of all so-called garrison communities. And garrison communities are territorially rooted, homogenous voting neighborhoods in downtown Kingston, where political support has been exchanged for contracts and other social welfare benefits. And these exchanges are mediated through a relationship between a legitimately elected politician and a local don. So Tivoli Gardens, downtown, garrison, and ghetto mark the slot of Blackness, insofar as Blackness refers to that position that both instantiates and potentially undermines and undoes the liberal order, right? The position that makes it insecure. To say that geography mediates the experience of racialized abjection connects the question of the value of Black life to the question of security and corruption. Just as some Black lives seem to matter more than others, some ghetto lives do as well. And those living in garrison communities often remain outside the realm of public empathy because they're seen to destabilize the security of democratic governance more generally. They're not always seen as worthy of protection. Their deaths are not always worthy of mourning. And indeed, Jamaica has long had one of the highest extrajudicial killing rates in the world. And compounding this have been innumerable reports of human rights abuses and the torture of suspects while in police custody, of the covering up of evidence, of the failure to prosecute, phenomena that have only been compounded by an inability to provide regular and appropriate mental health care. However, police violence and extrajudicial killing in Jamaica are not typically seen as part of the global phenomenon of anti-Black racism. But framing it in this way allows us to see how raciality is not merely tethered to physicality, but is instead grounded in both historical, ideological, and onto-epistemological phenomena that produce whiteness as the apex of humanity. This production presumes not only transparency and universality, but also determination, causality, and here I'm thinking with Sylvia Winter and Denise Ferreira da Silva. In other words, having defined itself as universal reason and absolute perspectivity, the interior humanity against which all exterior others are compared and measured and not measuring up, right? Western European empire inhabits the expression of sovereignty, not only within Europe, but also throughout the post-colonial world. And this is a sovereignty that is obsessed with security because its conquest, cannibalism, and disavowal of exteriority is never seamless or complete. It's always potentially undone by that which fails to recognize it, by that which refuses it in intentional and unconscious ways. And in Jamaica, these moments of refusal have been both quotidian and fleeting and transnational and durative, and these categories are themselves co-constituting. So as the COVID-19 curfews wore on through May of last year, the 10th anniversary of the Tivoli incursion, which began the 24th of May, 2010, threatened to pass without remembrance. The evening of the 24th of May, we received a phone call from a relative who works at one of the national television stations. And she asked if they could air our documentary the following day, since they had neglected to organize any commemorative programming related to the anniversary. So as 4 Days in May aired on TVJ on the evening of May 25th, George Floyd was being killed by police in Minneapolis. And as Jamaicans decried this act of police violence across various media, the police and army incursion into Tivoli Gardens was rarely mentioned, generating a loud and resonant silence. I guess people are still conflicted about Tivoli, a friend remarked. So I've been interested in this conflictedness and in the kinds of disavowal this produces. So George Floyd's murder by police generated intense public response across media platforms in Jamaica. And a couple newspaper columnists wondered out loud whether Black Lives Matter in Jamaica. One crunched some numbers and argued, and these are his words, if the police in the US killed proportionately the same number of people as the Jamaican police, they would have killed nearly 30,000 in 2013 instead of 1,100. And if the US police were to kill at Jamaica's rate during the period from 2014 to 2018, they would have killed around 65,000 more people. And if Jamaicans were killed at the rate that US Blacks are killed by US law enforcement, there would only be about 20 such deaths annually, which is roughly 1/7 of the number of police killings that occur in Jamaica. So what these authors were drawing attention to was that while it's important that middle and upper class Jamaicans recognize the ongoing travesty of police violence against African Americans, they should not turn a blind eye to the same violence occurring in Jamaica. As a friend of mine posted on Facebook, while the news of George Floyd's death was circulating, substituting Black for poor in any of the reports would reflect the way the similar conditions obtain in Jamaica. Black in Jamaica, remember, is often indexed through the geographical reference of garrison and downtown. And this should remind us that raciality is not merely produced through the visual apprehension of familiar difference, but is built interactively, intersubjectively, and dynamically. It is felt, made, and made relevant through relational practice with other humans, landscapes, and objects. That raciality is produced relationally is also what requires an analysis that moves beyond the historical and sociological dimensions of the political inequality, the political economy of inequality, to also parse its affective dimensions, as these are what generate performative moments of racial violence, even in majority Black settings. They are also what necessitate attempts at accountability. So I want to end by talking a bit about safety and how we might distinguish it from security. During one post-screening discussion of our film in Kingston, a woman who had been a political representative for the People's National Party, which is the other political party, with Tivoli being representative of the Jamaica Labour Party. She was a representative for the PNP during the height of the political turf wars in the late 1970s, and she spoke of being terrorized by the dawn of Tivoli Gardens during that period. She shook with rage as she asked, what has Tivoli learned from their experiences in 2010? When she asked this, she was not met with derision, even though her fury was palpable. She was not yet ready to do the work of accountability herself, but the Tivoli Gardens community residents who were also at the screening did not attempt to shout her down. Instead, the woman who had identified her nephew's burned body said, there are good and bad within Tivoli like everywhere else. One of the youth who had described his experiences in the film stood and sincerely thanked everyone for coming, especially all the uptown people, saying that he never would have thought so many people cared about what happened to him. And a longtime community activist responded gently, I think another way to ask that question is, what has Jamaica learned from the incursion? So here I felt our audience was reckoning with the question of complicity and with the problem of how to generate safety from insecurity within a context shaped by the cyclical quotidianity of violence at multiple levels of scale. Achille Mbembe has argued that the security state, quote, thrives on a state of insecurity, a kind of passion, or rather an affect, a condition, even a force of desire. And safety too is a kind of passion. And a safe world is one in which people feel connected to and cared for by others. And here I'm quoting Stevie, a prison abolitionist. One in which they have somebody who will look after them. One that is built on relationships of accountability. And there are local models for this, of course, models that include the practice of reasoning amongst Rastafari and the community-based problem solving of groups like the Sister Theatre Collective or the Violence Prevention Alliance. These kinds of practices do not replicate the colonial love of governance, regulation, and tutelage, but instead are forms of emergent, non-eventful sovereignty in action, forms that seek to generate mature, responsible love, or what Aisha Shahida Simmons would call love with accountability. Generating safety from insecurity in a context in which violence is quotidian requires enacting modes of sovereignty that nullify normative relations upholding being as the ground of subjectivity and governance. And if we do this, then Black lives might matter in a Black country or anywhere else. And on that note, I'm going to pass us over to Savannah.
Wow, Deb, thank you so much, both for curating this conversation today, but also for these incredible comments and the work with 4 Days in May. In addition to Deb, I also wanted to thank Tina for bringing us together, and Kundai also for your administrative labor. I know we're short on time, so I'll try to get right to it. Which is, as no surprise, when I was asked to think about sovereignty, I turned immediately to Jari Marbonia's work on non-sovereignty, given that I'm both an anthropologist and a contrarian. For Bonilla, the history of the Caribbean demonstrates that sovereignty is a fiction, and I'm quoting from her here. It is not and has never been what it claims to be. So when I first read Non-Sovereign Futures, I saw this idea as kind of a gotcha, right? Sovereignty claims to be this universal truth of politics, exactly the kind of normative version of sovereignty you were talking about, Deb. But this, universal truth is a lie, right? Re-encountering it in this moment, I'm thinking of this idea of sovereignty is a fiction a little differently. What if it's not just a fiction, but fiction, storytelling, speculation, a tale we can craft towards our own purposes? What is sovereignty without a claim? Deb, you've pushed us to think and orient differently towards a sovereignty otherwise that is not necessarily claimed from a state or as a state, but one that is embodied, spoken, sensed, nurtured, played, danced into being. It's a memory of a possible future mourned. And it's mourning that grounds my remarks today. I want to take seriously this gambit of practicing refusal and participate in the collective's activation today. And I'm going to practice some refusing of the form of the academic talk. And most of my time will be spent on a collective meditation exercise that was part of a community installation that I helped put together last summer. As we all remember, there was a wave of righteous rebellion that emerged in the streets of the US and in cities across the world in the wake of the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And of course, that wave is part of an ocean of resistance and refusal across 5 centuries and 6 continents of Black livingness. At the same time, the US was at that moment, right, in May and June 2020, the US was already a global leader in bungling the COVID crisis, and Black and Native people in particular were dying at obscene rates. A small group of folks, myself, Maisha Davis, who's pictured here, and Mia Birdsong, wanted to contribute to this defense of Black lives that were lost and honor the dead in a way that also protected Black livingness, right? Creating a way to participate in this community resistance in ways that also were more accessible for folks who may be immunocompromised or otherwise trying to mitigate the impacts of the virus. So we wanted to create a way to honor the dead that was also socially distant, right? So created the Altars for Black Lives project, which began with a roaming shrine in San Francisco and culminated in a day-long altar build and walking meditation in downtown Oakland. So community altar building is not at all new, from kind of the public shrine practices you see across the diaspora to the National Defend Black Womanhood altar action in 2016. I'd love to talk about kind of the political sacred more if that comes up in our discussion time. As is kind of customary in these spaces, there's a pastiche of both specific ancestral and diasporic practices that may draw on Santeria or Yoruba or Diné traditions, and the kind of quote unquote African practices that are squarely rooted in the longings of Black New Worldness, right? Water, white cloth, cowries, paper to offer prayers, candles. The altar was set up on a single table, but the entire city block, right, was the setting for a temporary installation of a moving meditation that we called We Stand for Black Life, which featured 44 different invitations to honor Black people killed by police and patriarchal violence. Each meditation poster was laminated and taped to the sidewalk with duct tape, roughly kind of 15 feet apart. It was oriented around both walking and rolling, so folks who use mobility devices would also be able to navigate. The meditation flowed in one direction towards the altar, both to set the tone of the space and to create kind of a more one direction flow in terms of social distancing. We installed it on a street directly adjacent to the Oscar Grant Plaza, which is the main rally site for most protests in the town, and a few blocks from the city hall, located in a kind of a place that was nested inside the cartography of this particular moment of struggle. And can I go ahead and show, I'm gonna go ahead and show a short video clip just to see how folks were engaging with the space. We did let folks know that it was happening, but because of the way this street is organized, many passersby who use this street engaged with the posters. Some came to be in ceremony. And now I want to turn to an opportunity for us to be in community with these folks. And so the form of the moving meditation that was used was inspired by the Gatha, right? A Gatha is a traditional Zen verse prayer that synchronizes breathing with everyday activity. So there's traditional gathas that, start around depending on who you talk to, like 7th or 8th century, that maybe gathas for bowing, or gathas for washing dishes, or gathas for, this or that. For instance, there's a gatha for washing your hands, where you might inhale and think, water flows over these hands. Exhale, may I use them skillfully to preserve our planet, right? And so it's these kind of ideas that there are short phrases that you pair with breathing to attune your attention, to attune your energy, and make a commitment. These are gathas in the defense of Black life. And at this moment, I would like to invite us all to participate in a short portion of this meditation that was done in Oakland. I put together 12 different posters here. And to participate, I ask you to kind of shift your body, get back into it, wherever you are. If you're sitting, maybe inch forward and put your feet on the ground. If you are in bed or in a mobility device, kind of shifting yourself around left and right, just to kind of make contact with gravity. And we'll take some breaths together. I will speak through these gathas. Feel free to either tune out my voice or primarily read. And in general, I invite you to just pay attention to your experience, however it goes forth in the next kind of 3 or 4 minutes. Ready? Breathe in. I see her face. Breathe out. I speak her name. And I invite you to speak each of these names with me. Remy Fells. Breathe in. I commit to protect the living. Breathe out. I know we will be free. Breathe in. See her face. Breathe out. Speak her name. Breonna Taylor. Breathe in. Commit to protect the living. Breathe out. Know we will be free. Breathe in. See his face. Breathe out. Speak his name. Trayvon Martin. Breathe in. Commit to protect the living. Breathe out. Know we will be free. Breathe in. See her face. Breathe out. Speak her name. Leilene Polanco Extravaganza. Breathe in. Commit to protect the living. Breathe out. Know we will be free. Breathe in. See his face. Breathe out. Speak his name. Lavelle Mixon. Breathe in. Commit to protect the living. Breathe out. Know we will be free. Breathe in. See her face. Breathe out. Speak her name. Nina Pop. Breathe in. Commit to protect the living. Breathe out. Know we will be free. Breathe in. See her face. Breathe out. Speak her name. Breathe in. Corinne Gaines. Breathe in. Commit to protect the living. Breathe out. Know we will be free. Breathe in. See his face. Breathe out. Speak his name. Tony McDade. Breathe in, commit to protect the living. Breathe out, know we will be free. Breathe in, see his face. Breathe out, speak his name. Mario Woods. Breathe in, commit to protect the living. Breathe out, know we will be free. Breathe in, see his face. Breathe out, speak his name. Khalif Browder. Breathe in, commit to protect the living. Breathe out, know we will be free. Breathe in, see her face. Breathe out, speak her name. Ayanna Stanley Jones. Breathe in, commit to protect the living. Breathe out, I know we'll be free. Breathe in, see his face. Breathe out, speak his name. Daniel Prude. Breathe in, commit to protect the living. Breathe out, know we will be free. "12 ancestors, 24 breaths for Black life. Last I checked, there were 173 of us gathered here today. That's 4,152 breaths for Black life. If we were in person or in a more kind of haphazard Zoom space with the chat going, I would ask you to raise your hand if you said aloud a name you've heard before, saw someone whose story you knew a bit of. And if you did, you might recognize that that wasn't, one of those photos was not right. That wasn't a photo of Ayanna Stanley Jones. I'll pick up her photo before we end here. I would also ask you if there's any names that were new to you on this list. I might also ask if you spoke aloud the names or said them in your head or inside. If you did speak them aloud, what was it like to speak to a screen? I might also ask that if you chose otherwise to observe or be an audience in this process, as opposed to participating in the meditation, just reflecting on how that felt and what that audience position might reflect about your own relationships to the struggle and what might be the ways that you craft what Deb might call a ethics of responsibility in relation to anti-Black violence. So we ended with Daniel Prude, who many of us have at top of mind because just yesterday, a grand jury of 23 New Yorkers gathered and declined to charge the 7 men in uniform who were charged with his killing. That means for at least 12 of them, Daniel's asphyxiation under a spit hood, naked on the brick cold sidewalk in Rochester, was an incident, but not an event. He was high and losing it. He asked a neighbor to call for help, but the police came, and now he can't call anybody at all. Daniel's death was declared a homicide, but murder is incidental to the function of policing in the Americas, across the Americas. And thank you for Deb for putting this outside of this exceptional US context. But rather than died, killed, murdered, all true. In the meditation installation, we chose to use the phrase breath stolen to notate the theft of life. Breath that belonged to someone who descended from belongings. I'm thinking here, of course, about Christina Sharp's theory of aspiration, or the returning of breath to the Black body. Aspiration is both the act, we can think of it as both the act of the bellows, right? Breathe in, breathe out. Times 24, times 4,152. Breath stolen also presences pulmonary Blackness while attempting restitution. Returning breath, not to the title case Black body, but to bring our breaths as offerings to Daniel, to Remy, to Nina, to Ayana. Return what belonged to them in the first place to invoke an alternate dimension in which ancestors breathe beside us. So we're asked to respond to what does sovereignty feel like? And I get stuck with the like, right? Perhaps there is no like, no cognate, no simulacra, or to use Sylvia Winter's framework, no descriptive statement for sovereignty. But even if we don't know what sovereignty feels like, for me, the meditation for Black life was an opportunity to feel sovereignty, right? To make sensory contact with its velvety, cool sadness, to breathe ourselves adjacent to liberation. And this is where, again, your work has been so indispensable, Deb, because the meditation for Black lives, I do think of it as what you call an archive for affect, right? In the sense that it was, quote, a technology of deep recognition that can cultivate a sense of mutuality that not only exposes complicity, but also demands collective accountability. That accountability can come in the tense of the declarative, I commit to protect the living, as well as in the interrogative. How have you defended Black life today? After the day-long, I bring that question up because after the day-long event, the meditation placards stayed on the sidewalk and I went to kind of tend them in their afterlife and try to keep them as part of the public space as long as possible. But the altar, however, it was reinstalled in the window of a local nonprofit dedicated to empowering system-involved young women of color. The candles, water, collages, copies of the meditation posters were all arranged in the bright bay windows of this organization on Lakeshore Avenue, which is a major pedestrian thoroughfare. Above the altar, we hung a printed sign, one word on each piece of 8x11 paper. How have you defended Black life today? It's a question we asked of the passersby, but it's also a question that I ask myself, and then I ask you. In honor of Ayanna Stanley Jones, I just want to end with her image, so we have some time to spend with her, because she didn't have enough time to spend with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for bringing this gathering together. Thanks to the Sojourner. Thanks to all who, as you say, make it seem so cohesive and seamless, but so much labor goes into doing so. And yes, Savannah, thank you. I mean, I, for one, am so deeply grounded by what you've just done and asked us to do, and for invoking those absent presences into this gathering. Thank you so much. So I would like to pick up on a more ephemeral and tenuous conception of sovereignty. And this is something that Deb has laid out from the very conception of this collaboration. One which I understand as calling for a rethinking and refeeling of sovereignty and its race and gendered framing from locations of precarity, but also of desire, imagination, and a kind of Black femme virtuosity. I will be speaking alongside, from, and within This Song Is For, a 22-channel video and sound installation I started showing in 2019. I would like to reflect upon and ask us to collectively gather around a set of ideas that for me are at the social and political heart of this work. And these are the scratch and the rhapsodic. This Song Is For is a song cycle comprised of 11 dedication songs, each chosen by a survivor of rape and shared with me along with the color of their choosing as well as a textual reflection. Reperformed by a group of women and genderqueer-led musical ensembles, these are songs of personal significance to the survivors, songs that transport them back to a particular time and place, evoking a sensory world of memory and feeling. Introduced within each of the songs is a sonic disruption, a recurring musical rupture recalling the broken record effect of a scratched vinyl LP. Presented in this performed disruption is an opportunity for listeners to affectively inhabit a contested space of traumatic recall, one in which the desubjectifying violence of rape and its psychic afterlives become painfully entangled with personal and political claims to life, dignity, hope, faith, and even joy. Let's begin with Nondumiso Msimanga's song, Bohemian Rhapsody, shared with me as a dedication song to her own survival. And these are the words she offered to accompany a song and to hold the space in which it sounds. I tried to kill myself. I still want to kill myself. I have to fight to not want to kill myself. I don't want to just die. I'm a fighter, and every day I'm fighting for my life, fighting for it to matter. Here's to the good fight. Nondumiso's offering speaks to the proximate relation of rape to death, to the extent that rape is a physical violence, but also an inscriptive and deeply political violence, historically informed and recycled in the present as a marking of certain bodies as disposable, as rapeable and killable, as matter that does not matter. Flo, another survivor and extraordinary person with whom I collaborated on this project, shared her song with me, Don't Wish Me Well. And these are her words which never fail to undo me. Death knocked on my door. He took away my innocence for sure. Death left me on the sewer floor with a soul no more. For Phumla Dineo, this death that is rape is inseparable from the structural self-perpetuation of patriarchal power, reigning in, enforcing submission, and punishing defiance. This is patriarchy as constitutive of colonial modernity, and its racialized, gendered, sexualized, economized, and nationalized hierarchization of human life. It is an everyday normative crisis of rape culture that clearly communicates which lives matter and perpetuates the disposability of those that do not. Here in South Africa, but also transnationally, it is a paradigm of permissible violence in which Black femme life is marked, tracked, traced, and determined by conditions of death and a drive to negation. Such are the political conditions of inscription, of lived precarity, that makes sense of and render urgent the Black feminist injunction to refuse. For to live is to live in spite of, in the refusal of this terminal demarcation. And so I circle back to Nondumiso and hear this refrain of refusal and claim in spite of all. I have to fight to not want to kill myself. I don't want to just die. I'm a fighter, and every day I'm fighting for my life, fighting for it to matter. Here's to the good fight. And here I would like to introduce the idea and site of encounter that is the scratch. And as I share this short extract from the work, ask that we briefly linger within it.
Sometimes wish I'd never been born at all, yeah. 'Cause nothing really matters. Anyone can feel. Nothing really matters to me. Anyway, the wind blows. 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 Anyway, the wind blows.
What I just played for you is a short preview of Bohemian Rhapsody. The full song runs over 20 minutes, with the intervention of the scratch drawing audiences into an extended sonic encounter. At times demanding, jarring, but then also mesmerizing, ritualistic, and I do believe potentially transforming. Participants inhabit for a time this location of cyclic recall, as the event of rape returns as trauma and haunts life. But it is also a location of deep entanglement, of counterclaims, as a desire to survive, to live, insistently performs a refusal of death, refusing the negation of Black femme life that is the governing logic of this normative patriarchal violence, but laying claim to possibility in spite of. Songs carry us along, shift and shape our moods, and very often transport us back or imagine us into different time and place, invoke a sensory world of smell, touch, feeling. This was central to why I worked with song as an alternative modality of representation and as a way of affectively broaching and to some degree making shareable experiences of trauma. The scratch for me, however, is a way of introducing a difficulty, a temporal shift and discomfort. There is a halting impediment to the flow, a sonic glitch that frustrates the listening experience and confronts audiences with something they just can't get past. This is important to me as a means of establishing a certain set of conditions, terms of our engagement with these dedication songs. Sorry, excuse me. In seeking to approach the suffering, pain, and trauma of another, we are confronted by the inherent limit of representation, as these experiences exceed our modes of articulation and our capacity to understand or fully relate. Language falters, and our coming to know emerges as a certain unknowing. In the scratch, the opacity of the traumatic experience comes to the fore and becomes, for those willing to work with its difficulty, the opportunity for a different kind of knowing. Helpful in thinking about the possibility and imperative of this relation of the scratch is Sarah Ahmed's conception of the sociality of pain. Here, the experience of pain is informed by encounters with the world of surfaces, objects, bodies. The injury of pain, however, is always such that the pain one feels cannot be felt by another. If it is to be shared, it must be on terms other than commensurate experience, what Ahmed calls the impossibility of fellow feeling. This is not to suggest that suffering bodies have no bearing on others, but rather that the sociality of pain, complicated by the irreducibility of its experience, calls for an alternative ethics of empathic response. To linger in the scratch is then to inhabit a certain relation, not of commonality or the presumed empathy of over-identification, but a contingent mutuality of political bearing and acknowledged, often incommensurable difference. This calls for something more than bearing witness, but rather an implicated, embodied interrelation, or what Tina Campt describes as an effortful practice of hapticity. This is not empathy or feeling for, as much as it is the precarious feeling in relation to, or as she puts it, the labor of love required to feel across difference, precarity, and suffering, of creating and sustaining affiliation and intimacy by embracing the inextricability of joy and trauma. And it is this implicated relational inhabitants of the scratch that this song is for seeks to enable and open up. This is a relation and community premised on the uneasy terms of difference and bearing. And it is such a relation that I recognize and hope for a certain capacity for transformation, a possibility for possibility, for the reinscription of Black femme life. And so from the scratch, with the scratch, I turn to the effusive, ephemeral working or performing of the rhapsodic. In situ, the scratch plays and plays and plays as this difficult repeat, and then the song opens up and resumes. And when it does, there is the most extraordinary sense of release, and yes, a kind of rhapsodic lightness. And that is a part of what I'm thinking about in relation to this idea of the rhapsodic. But this is not to suggest that what I'm thinking about is a kind of hereafter or a getting over and past. In some dialectical framing of trauma as event and healing as resolution. Rather, it is about the possibility of a certain rhapsodic space opening from within that glitch and difficulty of the scratch. In Rhapsody, we think of a certain affective register, a performed possibility of rapture, the ecstatic, of extravagant emotion. And it comes to us through music, improvisatory and irregular in form. And it speaks to a certain virtuosity that plays out in this open irregularity. What happens and what becomes possible when the song is radically disrupted, shifted of course, and altered through a sustained sonic incursion? As the repeated performance of the scratch, the sonic incursion is truly virtuosic. For these collaborating musicians to perform the broken record moment, sometimes over 20 minutes, is a technical and durational feat. And so what is interesting to me is how the rhapsodic begins to sound and resound within the difficulty of the scratch. And not only as a kind of release or return to form, but as an opening within the difficulty, a possibility within the impossibility. For me, thinking the rhapsodic always in uneasy relation to the scratch, to its difficulty and disruption, is thinking about possibility within contexts of violent inscription, about hospitable spaces for relation and community that open within, as Catherine McKittrick suggests, the folds of power. This is about a sociality premised on difference and bearing, open to love as effortful labor, as practices of refusal, as Black virtuosity, as intimacy, care, and the everyday reinscription of Black femme life on terms other than those of negation and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And indeed, having watched and listened to a number of those longer form songs, it is a rhapsodic moment when the scratch finishes. And that's a really, I really love how you formulated that. Okay, so in the interest of generating some questions, I was really interested in, I think there were a number of themes that really cross-cut people's different offerings. And I want to sort of land on one and think it through something that Savannah said about the political sacred. Because I was interested in the many versions of memorializing, commemorating, forgetting to commemorate, and rethinking what that looks like as a performative practice across the different contexts that you all were talking about. And then, the role of naming and the role of repetition in those practices. And I was wondering, Savannah, maybe you could start us off. I was wondering if one might see this naming and this repetition of framing as a way to attempt to create subjectivity where it's impossible, and if this is what you see as part of an agenda for the political sacred. Is that what you're thinking, thinking about when you're articulating that phrase? And if you could maybe say a thing or two about that, I'm sure others also will have something to say.
Deb, can you see the paragraph that I cut out of my talk for time?
I cannot.
Because I would say yes and no to the question, in the sense that I do think that naming and repetition have an agenda. I don't know that that agenda is in pursuit of a subjectivity necessarily. And I'm thinking here in particular about Say Her Name, the hashtag Say Her Name, which is both kind of a digital political agenda and also one that uses naming and the saying of names, specifically Black women's names, that started kind of around, it started in this moment when Sandra Bland was killed. It was first coined by the AAPF, but when Sandra Bland was killed, and then also used to talk about Black trans women who were killed both by police and in street interpersonal violence, and it's kind of emerged as a critique of masculinist readings of spectacular kinds of violence, right? And so that is an example of a use of naming that seeks to do a little bit of what we're trying to do in this project, which is bringing together police and patriarchal violence, right? Which is to say police violence and state violence is part of, but not the boundary of anti-Black violence, right? Which is, in a sense, is a refusal of, which is a kind of, we might think of it as an abolitionist stance, in the sense that it does not respect the state's boundaries, right? It doesn't trust the state to say what it is as kind of the arbiter of only kinds of violence that we're fighting. And so to me, say her name in a way that brings together this larger archive of ancestors is a way to create a politics that's not opposed to only certain kinds of anti-Black violence or to only respond to certain regimes of legibility, but to really pull out this broader set of vulnerabilities and create collectivity between groups that may have otherwise seen themselves as different sectors, right? So I think that's part of it. The piece around the political sacred, I think there's, I mean, I know I'm most familiar with the US context, so I think in this kind of like post-2012 movement for Black Lives TM moment of Black US political struggle, there is a high note, right? A treble clef of healing and healing practice that runs through this. So for instance, BYP 100 has a healing and safety chair and a team, right? You'll go to actions and there will be both security, right, which is there to defend a certain kind of safety, and there'll also be healing response or like emergency response folks who may be present with being able to pray with someone, to have sage, right, things like that, these kind of pastiche of different practices that see an extra human, right, that see a plane outside of the rational and the political as necessary to this agenda.
Yeah, and what's so striking, I think, to me about the meditation form that you gave us, about Gabrielle's scratch, is the repetition, you know, and it's something that Khwezi raised in his comments, just very briefly, just almost to throw away this idea of ancestral practices, you know, and that brought for me the kind of repetition in that practice, which is meant to generate an alternative form of communication, right? And it is meant to open oneself up to a different relationship with the ancestors and the others with whom we are sharing space. So I really, you know, I would love if Gabrielle or Khwezi, you would address that a bit.
You know, Deb, I mean, absolutely. So for me, it is so important to, particularly if I think of my work and I think of whom I am approaching in my work, and seeking to create hospitable space for and hold space for. And so often these gatherings are tenuous. For me, it is really important from the onset to not approach a violence in general. And so here I'm turning to the concept of naming. Specificity, particular lived lives, individuals, is very key for me. When you walk into that space of the songs for, you're not just walking into a scenario of this spectacle of violence that can so often render people faceless, anonymous. And you're walking into a space of sometimes individuals who claim a certain kind of agency where they choose to withhold their names. And I believe that that is an agency that they can claim. And then those who are named, and those who have shared their favorite color and a song that invokes something very particular. So that to me is really key, that particular specificity that really directs us towards particular individuals, particular lives, particular lived experiences. And then of course the for me, what is also then very key about repetition, and I think I'm going to turn to in your provocation right in the beginning, this question that you constantly turn to, the human. And I particularly in a work that, and this is what so often makes these experiences so devastating within a work like This Song Is For. What is it that makes rape so proximate to the experience of death? Is that, and here I turn to Puma Dene-Nkola again, because she really is foundational in her formulation around understanding rape culture and what makes it normative and what renders certain individuals precarious and subject to this nature of violence. And if we attend to that so carefully, it demands of us to attend to slavocratic society here within the Cape, within South Africa. And of course, this demands really careful, really attentive work. And this is why I so often say that it's really important to acknowledge that this is violence that extends beyond the physical. It is endemic, it is structural, it is so normative, it is so insidious, and it is terrifyingly ordinary. And so for me, the work of repetition becomes a very important and critical socio-political gesture, because it's about sounding and resounding and pushing back and seeking to, against all of this violence, to reinscribe back into this demarcation of negation, Black femme life. So that's where that becomes really important. And then of course, the actual experience of it, I'm speaking about it now, but the experience of it in situ is transference, which you've experienced in my work. It's about transference, it's about affect, it's about sound, light, color. Yeah.
Thanks, Gabrielle. And yeah, thanks for that, Deb. So just a note of, I think, more kind of like an ambivalent response to the question of naming, and something that I've been sort of thinking about and thinking through. That, in some senses, what we've also seen in the past year as a response to sort of, fees must fall, etc., is a kind of attempt to sort of reinscribe and sort of rename colonial spaces and legacies, where they're thinking about the removal of the statue, but also Jameson Hall being named Marikana Memorial Hall, having, Sarah Batman Hall, Solomon Mahlangu House at its university. And part of what I've been thinking about is that process of naming is, in some senses, perhaps about a particular relationship to the political, but I can't help but think that it's also about a particular relationship to time and temporality, right? Because in some senses, particularly in our sort of present moment, if one thinks about the political, it's sort of undergirded often by kind of like the sort of temporality of apartheid. Maybe you could go back to state formation in South Africa in 1910 and the Natives Land Act, but those are just, just 1 century sort of codifying, can sort of hold together all of the different kinds of ruptures and sort of changes within sort of South African history. So the note of ambivalence is about what the naming in some senses makes possible in terms of reinscribing, but also what it doesn't, and to return to what Gabrielle was saying, that, slavery has been so foundational to sort of South Africa, but, oftentimes kind of the discourse of slavery sort of gestures towards this very sort of complicated kind of diasporic relation, right? That oftentimes it's about sort of notions of subjectivity that could be sort of drawn from the American experience of slavery. But what is it that doesn't make it possible to talk about slavery in South Africa or the Cape? I mean, one of the fascinating things for me about being in Cape Town was that I was able to attend, Emancipation Day celebration, right? And where you sort of sort of gentrified city center, you see sort of Black colored folk, coming to sort of again, sort of remember their ancestors and marking sort of this journey toward freedom. But again, it's sort of this memorialization that that only sort of Black or colored people, depending on what your framing is, sort of partake in, right? And it's not something that is sort of brought into the fold of any kind of national imagination or memory, precisely because of the kinds of complications, I think, that it'll bring about sort of thinking about forms of redress as well that sort of exceed that moment. Yeah? So again, if one thinks about the TRC as a foundational moment, often is thinking about political violence and forms of human rights violations, from 1960 onwards, right? That makes a particular kind of conversation possible, but there's so much else that it doesn't make possible.
I feel like this is a really nice place to insert two questions that seem to be speaking to each other and to everyone on the panel as well. And to pose them sort of in conversation, and I'm going to be informal and say one from Gautam, who posed a question about spirituality and its role in undoing the liberal modern version of sovereignty. And the point is really important. I wonder if the idea of sovereignty that we are trying to undo is a violent secular one. Does the uptake of spiritualism mark a move away from the liberal ideal of secularism, and what might the pitfalls of moving away from this ideal be? And then Chengo, who poses a related question, how can we still find joy even though we have such a tense, and I'm thinking a tense relationship with the idea of sovereignty? And so I feel like the conversation that's going on in both of those questions is between the tense relationship to a particular iteration of sovereignty, right? A violent, secular, national formation, right? What are the possibilities that spirituality might offer, or spiritualism offer? And at the same time, what are the limits of that, of going in that direction? And I think all of you sort of are, actually the conversation together really is very suggestive, particularly along the lines of what does affect do? What does the invocation of names do? And I actually am going to add on to this because we've got about 20 minutes. My question here was also that you all just plucked my favorite string, which is, what if sovereignty is actually grammatical, right? What if sovereignty is a state of being that's a relationship to time that we might try and conjugate differently? I mean, I'm really responding in a lot of ways, Savannah, to the way in which you sort of were talking about the declarative, the interrogative, right? What if feeling is also a relationship to time, space, and being? And how does sovereignty mix that up? And how are all of you actually asking us to both disaggregate and reaggregate those things differently?
Maybe I'll start to Gautam, who ended with what might be the pitfalls of moving away from the liberal idea of secularism. I guess I would say, what have been the pitfalls of not moving away from that? What are our investments in a form of political independence in which the colonial institutions continue to organize our lives throughout the post-colonial period? I mean, of course, that's been the intervention of so many POCO theorists, but also, those of us who think in terms of afterlives. The imperialism, slavery have many, many, many afterlives. And we cannot, in my opinion, we cannot explore them or vanquish them to the extent that's even possible without moving outside of these normative frameworks, which doesn't mean to me, overthrowing the state such as it is in some sort of revolutionary manner, but instead speaks to a different level of scale, and one that is really much more about intimacy and the forms of, as Gabrielle just mentioned, transference, of relation and of differently thinking what it would mean to be in this world together that can happen on that smaller scale. And there I just want to raise the question of failure that Khwezi brought up, but I think we all contend with in different ways. And, you know, so often we say that movements fail or that revolutions failed. But the thing that's been so interesting to me is that when one iteration of a movement starts to fragment, the movement doesn't go away. You know, those who are involved in that at any particular moment carry that in them. They have undergone, we have undergone these affective transformations, and therefore we radiate that, right? And that's what makes it available to younger generations, to you know, people who weren't involved in the original iteration. They don't even know, but it's being transmitted, you know. And I think that you can see that sometimes. I've been able to see that sometimes in terms of how people are drawn to a certain individual, or drawn to a certain landscape, or drawn to something that's very different from what they would have ordinarily done. And that too, I think, is a form of repetition, you know, and I guess a temporal kind of repetition in a way, Teen, where you know, these transformative moments, these alternative understandings or versions or affects of sovereignty actually do live, move, breathe, and transmit and transfer, but not in the ways that we would ordinarily be able to map in any kind of concrete enlightenment terms. You know, so for me, that's what's so important about paying attention to the transmission of affect, to the moments of rhapsody, the rhapsodic, you know, to the moment of meditation and where one goes in that, to the moment of ultimate freedom on the dance floor, you know, wherever that is that you find that for yourselves. I think that is sort of a continuity, you know, of these movements that in fact have not failed. They've just taken another shape.
I think that's so important, bringing in the dance piece, because that's another section I cut out. Thinking part of what you say at the end of Political Life in the Wake of the Plantation, which everyone here should read again if you've already read it, also color photographs by the actual book. Part of what you talk about is diasporic dance practices, right? And being together, and that collectiveness of being in the body and making humanness, right, as something you forge together in that moment. And I think that happens on dance floors, meditative practices in ways that are both, they're interrelated. But this question about kind of uptaking spiritualism is interesting. I think from my position in politics and in the diaspora, I don't think that it was ever most of the iterations of Black radical work are deeply involved with both the spiritual and the religious. I mean, from the kind of like, it's Black History Month here in the United States. Every 5 minutes we see Malcolm X and MLK, right? Both of whom were religious leaders, both of whom were actual ordained, pastors and imams, right? From even now, the role of churches like in, Clive and Oneida Thompson are an undocumented Black Jamaican couple who are still, I think, right, living in a church in Philadelphia. And this ongoing sanctuary movement to protect undocumented immigrants in the US, many of whom are kind of racialized in a particular way as not Black, many of whom are Black, and many of the churches participating in that movement are also traditionally Black churches, right? From that to even most abolitionist organizing and political organizing in prison happens in the context of religious meetings, because religious meetings and chapel sessions are some of the only times that incarcerated people can meet and talk and be together. So I think the interrelation of spiritual and religious practice and Black struggle, at least proximal to where I am, is not new, right, or novel in any way. But I also want to speak about this idea of how do we find the joy, because I think sometimes there's a little bit we can internalize this Manichaean idea that there is a this and a that there is a joy and the pain, right? And this is, you see this kind of in the like, you know, it's the optimism, it's the pessimism, like, you know, this whole thing of like Black life, Black death. And we're cheering for these different teams and they're playing the same game, right? We understand that this is a wheel, this is an ongoingness. And so I'm thinking now about the work of like the Queering Slavery Working Group, right? Who are really kind of trying to disrupt an idea that there were just hundreds of years of just abjection, just pain, just suffering, just silence, just no, and thinking about what would pleasure, consent, joy, orgasm, ecstasy look like in the context of ongoing abjection, which is a very hard question for many of us to even encounter. It feels like blasphemy, right? And I think that feeling of blasphemy is also in relation to that spiritual practice, figuring out what is it that we hold sacred, right? And how can we break apart the notion that we have to choose between, right? Take away the borders we've internalized between joy and politics or sovereignty and non-sovereignty, and instead really practice. And I think the practice of knitting together is a practice of repetition. And you're talking about repetition, Devin. I think this repetition piece, whether it's a dance step or a hand sewn seam, right? There's something in repetition that crafts something new. And I'd love to think and feel more about that.
So just a quick, maybe two things for me. And one is an encounter that we had together with Christina, because I remember that when you were in Cape Town, we started sort of having conversations about the slave grave that was at the University of Cape Town that nobody knew. And so then we went on this sort of, you know, brief quest to find it. And I remember that it was right at the moment when we didn't think we'd find it, that, you know, there it was, very nondescript, hiding in plain sight, but one wouldn't sort of think about it, wouldn't think
We were
about it.
standing on top of it, weren't we? We were kind of standing there, right? Yeah.
And it was such a, I think that was what, 2018 sort of, you know, while the sort of protest sort of was happening. And for me, it's something that sort of juxtaposes to another sort of moment when one of the, you know, students that are sort of involved, she was in the law school, you know, the questions were also turning. It wasn't sort of reigned around sort of engaging with the sort of university and the state. But of course, 2 years into sort of this moment, students are also, you know, traumatized. They're, you know, sort of dealing with all forms of duress. You know, but then the question then became about what does it mean to be on the grounds that we're on? You know, and so I found that kind of turn. And again, it was the sense of the kind of the ancestral and spiritual turn also invoked what I, you know, right at the end of what I was thinking about, which me realizing, oh, this is what I really want to talk about, forms of reparation and healing, you know. Yeah, so yeah, for me, it's also about these forms of not only affect, but possibilities that you cannot sort of arrive at as an individual, you know. So again, arriving at the grave, or even the process of even daring to actually think about exploring the space that one thinks about every day as simultaneously a kind of a gravesite as well. And again, for me, you know, in the midst of all the sort of racket that was happening in that moment, I remember again, a Black queer woman saying, I'm tired, I want to go party, let's go party. And I remember thinking again, you know, I feel terrible. And it was the most liberating thing, again, because it was to be able to remember that kind of reparative moment and also that moment of joy is so important, because then what does it mean if your singular memories of being in struggle are marked simply by trauma and violence, right? So yeah, those are just two anecdotes for me that also speak to the kind of profound transformations that come with, as Gabrielle was saying, sort of this kind of collective engagement, that being able to arrive at an insight that one could not be able to sort of even begin to explore as an individual because of the contingencies of being together within that kind of political moment.
I don't really have much to add to that. After those really magnificent reflections, to perhaps, I mean, it's going to perhaps feel like I'm going off on a slight tangent, but I think if anything, I'd like to just return to when Deborah was talking about sort of alter forms of gathering and of how do we think about that, and how does this allow us to trouble this violent secular notion of sovereignty. And I suppose it really resonates so much with so much of what Khwezi was just saying, and so much of what Savannah's just been saying. And for me, yes, absolutely. I would also say that intersection of the spiritual, of faith, it's always been there. I don't think it's ever really gone away. And it manifests beyond religious affiliation, of course, within that too, but it manifests within those quotidian, intimate moments of transference and engagement. Those are spiritual moments of connection and relation that happen and that come into being. And I think that it really recalls quite strongly for me the visitors book that is present at the Songs for at the National Gallery in Cape Town. And there's so many messages recorded in there that are these accounts of these moments and these experiences that people have had within that space, within this work. And alongside these voices, alongside these accounts, these experiences, and within these songs, within the scratch. And this is bringing me to the idea of joy. So that's why I said it sounds like I'm going on a tangent, but actually not. So, you know, Tina, when you speak about the inextricability of joy and trauma, for me, this is it. This is it. It's they cannot be, and this is what you were saying, Savannah. You know, we can't think of these things as binaristic. They are so deeply knitted, as you so beautifully put it, but and entangled. And I think of these survivors and how they've challenged me on that. There's the death and the absolute incursion of rape in your life. But after that comes, despite that, in spite of, comes joy, comes life. But of course, there is, and this comes in the repetition. So the repetition can sometimes mark that agential value of that political gesture, but it can also mark trauma and the recall of trauma. And so within that, they are inextricable and they are entangled, but there is always joy, and there is that fight for life, as Nondumiso says. And as Khwezi says, there is that moment on the dance floor that one can, you know, share with friends. And those are so important and significant. So I think those are different kinds of altar gatherings and coming together.
That is the note that we should wrap up on. I feel like, you know, really about thinking about that temporality of joy that we need so much right now, and that we cannot let go of. And that I think that the four of you have woven together in asking us to rethink how we encounter the concept of sovereignty in so many different modalities. So I'm just going to wrap up by saying thank you, everyone, and by inviting you to come tune back into this station in April, the end of April. And thanks again to all who made it possible. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you, Tina. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Tina and Deb, Khwezi and Gabrielle. Great to share the space.
Thanks,
And
everyone.
also, thanks to our great tech team, Kunda and everyone
Yes,
else.
thank you. Waiting in the wings for us. Okay, take care.